Dear students, in this audio, we are going to start our chapter 2, Era of One Party Dominance, from your textbook in Political Science, Politics in India Since Independence. In this part, we will discuss the main points of the chapter, the main points to remember, and then we'll continue with the introduction of the chapter. So let's move to the main points. And I request all of you to listen to this very attentively. Number 1. Elections in India have played a very important role. 2. The Election Commission of India was set up in January 1950. 3. Sukumar Sen was the first Chief Election Commissioner of India. 4. The first general election was held in 1952, second in 1957, and the third in 1962. 6. Congress dominated in the first three elections. Congress secured 364, 371 and 361 seats in the first, second and third general elections of Lok Sabha. 7. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was the leader of the Congress party. 8. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru became the Prime Minister after the first general election. 9. In 1957, Communist Party formed the government in Kerala. 10. In 1959, the Congress government at the centre dismissed the Communist government in Kerala under Article 356 of the Constitution. 11. Socialist Party was formed in 1948. 12. Dr. Ambedkar was the founder of Independent Labour Party and later established the Republican Party of India. 13. The Communist Party of India won 16 seats in the first general election and emerged as the main opposition party. 14. In 1964, split within the Communist Party and CPIM was formed. 15. Bharatiya Jan Sangh was formed in 1951. 16. Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee was the founder president of Janasangh. 17. Swatantrata Party was formed in August 1959. 18. C. Rajagopalachari, a senior leader of Congress and literary writer, close associate of Mahatma Gandhi, member of Constituent Assembly, first Indian to be the Governor General of India, Minister in Union Cabinet, later became Chief Minister of Madras State, first recipient of Bharat Ratna Award, founder of the Swatantrata Party. And now, the introduction of the chapter. Election is one of the regular features of democracy. It is a contest among political parties for getting public votes. Political parties perform a series of functions such as contesting elections, putting forward different policies and programs, making laws for the country, forming and running the government. The electoral competition among political parties began immediately after independence. The chapter throws light on the first decade of electoral politics in order to understand number one, the establishment of a system of free and fair elections, two, the dominance of the Congress Party in the early years after independence, and three, the emergence of political parties and their policies. And in the second audio, we'll continue with the first topic of the chapter, challenge of building democracy. Thank you. Dear students, in the previous audio, we started our chapter 2, Era of One Party Dominance, from your textbook in political science, Politics in India Since Independence. And in that part of the audio, we discussed the main points of the chapter and also the introduction of the chapter. And in this part of the audio, we are going to start from the first topic of the chapter, that is challenge of building democracy. Challenge of building democracy. And I request once again all of you to be very attentive. After independence, the conditions in India were truly challenging. But the newly independent India decided to take the more difficult path. The Indian leaders became conscious of critical role of politics in a democracy, as they wanted to run politics as a method to sort out problems as well as to decide and pursue the public interest. Consequently, the Election Commission of India came into existence in January 1950. Sukumar Sen became the first Chief Election Commissioner of India to hold elections in the country. This commission required the drawing of the boundaries of electoral constituencies, electoral roll consisting eligible voters to hold free and fair elections. The Election Commission discovered that it was not going to be easy to hold a free and fair election in a country of India's size. Holding an election required delimitation or drawing the boundaries of the electoral constituencies. It also required preparing the electoral rolls or the list of all the citizens eligible to vote. Both these tasks took a lot of time. When the first draft of the rolls was published, it was discovered that the names of nearly 40 lakh women were not recorded in the list. They were simply listed as wife of or daughter of. The Election Commission refused to accept these entries and ordered a revision if possible and deletion if necessary. Preparing for the first general election was the mammoth exercise. No election on this scale had ever been conducted in the world before. At that time, there were 17 crore eligible voters who had to elect about 3,200 MLAs and 489 members of Lok Sabha. Only 15% of these eligible voters were literate. Therefore, the Election Commission had to think of some special method of voting. The Election Commission trained over 3 lakh officers and polling staff to conduct the elections. However, the first general election of India became a landmark due to its competitiveness, encouraging participation, fair results, and proved its critics wrong not to hold elections in conditions of poverty. It was not just the size of the country and the electorate that made this election unusual. The first general election was also the first big test of democracy in a poor and illiterate country. Till then, democracy had existed only in the prosperous countries, mainly in Europe and North America, where nearly everyone was literate. An Indian editor called it the biggest gamble in history. Organizer, a magazine, wrote that Jawaharlal Nehru would live to confess the failure of universal adult franchise in India. A British member of the Indian Civil Service claimed that a future and more enlightened age will view with astonishment the absurd farce of recording the votes of millions of illiterate people. The Indian experiment had proved the critics wrong. The Times of India held that the polls have confounded all those skeptics who thought the introduction of adult franchise too risky an experiment in this country. Observers outside India were equally impressed. India's general election of 1952 became a landmark in the history of democracy all over the world. It was no longer possible to argue that democratic elections could not be held in conditions of poverty or lack of education. It proved that democracy could be practiced anywhere in the world. Now, a little information about changing methods of voting. In the first general election, it was decided to place inside each polling booth a box for each candidate with the election symbol of that candidate. Each voter was given a blank ballot which they had to drop into the box of the candidate they wanted to vote for. About 20 lakh steel boxes were used for this purpose. After the first two elections, this method was changed. Now the ballot paper carried the names and symbols of the candidates, and the voter was required to put a stamp on the name of the candidate they wanted to vote for. This method worked for nearly 40 years. Towards the end of the 1990s, the Election Commission started using the electronic voting machines (EVMs). In 2004, electronic voting machine was introduced to press the button according to the choice of the voter containing the name of the candidate and symbol of the political party. Dear students, in the previous two audios, we were discussing our chapter 2, Era of One Party Dominance, from your textbook, Contemporary World Politics. And in that part, we discussed the main points of the chapter, the introduction, and the first topic, challenge of building democracy. And in the previous audios, you were given the assignment also, and I hope that you have already completed that assignment. And now we'll continue with the same chapter from our second topic, Congress dominance in the first three general elections. And I request all of you to be very attentive. The Congress evolved from its origin in 1885 as a pressure group for newly educated professional and commercial classes to a mass movement in the 20th century. This laid the basis for its eventual transformation into a mass political party and its subsequent domination of the political system. The results of the first general election did not surprise anyone. The Congress Party inherited the legacy of the national movement. It was the only party then to have an organization spread all over the country. And at the end, as Jawaharlal Nehru, the party got the most popular and charismatic leader in Indian politics. The Communist Party of India, that came next in terms of seats, won only 16 seats. None of the opposition parties could win even one-tenth of the number of seats won by the Congress. In the state assembly elections, the Congress did not get majority in few cases. The most significant of these cases was in Kerala in 1957 when a coalition led by the CPI formed the government. Apart from exceptions like this, the Congress controlled the national and all the state governments. The extent of the victory of the Congress was artificially boosted by our electoral system. The Congress won 3 out of every 4 seats, but it did not get even half of the votes. In 1952, for example, the Congress obtained 45% of the total votes, but it managed to win 74% of the seats. The Socialist Party, the second largest party in terms of votes, secured more than 10% of the votes all over the country. But it could not even win 3% of the seats. How did this happen? For this, you need to recall the discussion about the first past the post method in your textbook Indian Constitution at Work last year. In this system of election that has been adopted in our country, the party that gets more votes than others tends to get much more than its proportional share. That is exactly what worked in favor of the Congress. If we add up the votes of all the non-Congress candidates, it was more than the votes of the Congress. But the non-Congress votes were divided between different rival parties and candidates. So the Congress was still way ahead of the opposition and managed to win. No doubt, in the 1952 election, Congress party scored a big victory, but it was not in power in a few states. Congress dominated in India due to identification with freedom struggle, popular appeal of charismatic leaders, a broad manifesto including every section of society and consensus building role of party. Now a little information about PRI. PRI, founded in 1929 as National Revolutionary Party and later renamed as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI exercised power in Mexico for almost 6 decades. It represented the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. Mexican Revolution was a major armed struggle that was between 1910 to 20 that radically transformed Mexican culture and government. Originally, PRI was a mixture of various interests, including political and military leaders, labor and peasant organizations, and numerous political parties. Over a period of time, Plutarco Elias Calles, the founder of PRI, was able to capture the organization and thereby the government. Elections were held at regular intervals, and it was the PRI which won every time. Other parties existed in name only so as to give the ruling party greater legitimacy. The electoral laws were operated in a manner so as to ensure that the PRI always won. Elections were often rigged and manipulated by the ruling party. Its rule was described as the perfect dictatorship. Finally, the party lost in the presidential elections held in 2000. Mexico is no longer a one party dominated country, but the tactics adopted by the PRI during the period of its dominance had a long term effect on the health of democracy. The citizens have yet to develop full confidence in the free and fair nature of elections. Dear students, this is the fourth and the last audio of the chapter Era of One Party Dominance, and we'll continue the chapter with the topic Congress as Social and Ideological Coalition. The Congress started as a party dominated by the English speaking upper caste, upper middle class, and urban elite. But with every civil disobedience movement it launched, its social base widened. It brought together diverse groups whose interests were often contradictory. The Congress was an ideological coalition. It accommodated the revolutionary and pacifist, conservative and radical, extremist and moderate, and the right, left, and all shades of the center. The Congress was a platform for numerous groups, interests, and even political parties to take part in the national movement. Now, the next topic tolerance and management of factions. The coalition like character of the Congress gave it an unusual strength. Firstly, a coalition accommodates all those who join it. Therefore, it has to avoid any extreme position and strike a balance on almost all issues. Secondly, in a party that has the nature of a coalition, there is a greater tolerance of internal differences and ambitions of various groups, and leaders are accommodated. Even if a group was not happy with the position of the party or with its share of power, it would remain inside the party and fight the other group rather than leaving the party and becoming an opposition. These groups inside the party are called factions. The coalitional nature of the Congress party tolerated and in fact encouraged various factions. Some of these factions were based on ideological considerations, but very often these factions were rooted in personal ambitions and rivalries. Instead of being a weakness, internal factionalism became a strength of the Congress. Since there was a room within the party for various factions to fight with each other, it meant that leaders representing different interests and ideologies remained within the Congress rather than go out and form a new party. Most of the state units of the Congress were made up of numerous factions. The factions took different ideological positions, making the Congress appear as a grand centrist party. The other parties primarily attempted to influence these factions and thereby indirectly influenced policy and decision making from the margins. They were far removed from the actual exercise of authority. They were not alternatives to the ruling party. Instead, they constantly pressurized and criticized, censored and influenced the Congress. The system of factions functioned as balancing mechanism within the ruling party. Political competition therefore took place within the Congress. In that sense, in the first decade of electoral competition, the Congress acted both as the ruling party as well as the opposition. That is why this period of Indian politics has been described as the Congress system. And now let's move to the next topic, emergence of opposition parties. And before we discuss the topic, let us first of all form a question based on the topic. During the early years of independence, despite the fact that the opposition parties had a token representation, they played a crucial role in maintaining the democratic character of the system. How? I repeat, during the early years of independence, despite the fact that the opposition parties had a token representation, they played a crucial role in maintaining the democratic character of the system. How? And here is the answer. After independence, the Congress party dominated Indian politics. In the first three elections, the Congress party secured more than two-thirds seats in the Lok Sabha. Even then, many opposition parties emerged in the Lok Sabha. Though there was no official and recognized opposition in the Lok Sabha, yet there were many small opposition parties who played an important role in maintaining the democratic character of the system. The roots of almost all the non-Congress parties of today can be traced to one or the other of the opposition parties of 1950s. Though opposition parties had a token representation in the Lok Sabha, yet opposition leaders were very effective due to their status and personality. The opposition parties criticized the policies of the Congress party and kept the ruling party under control. The opposition parties believe in healthy and positive criticism. Thus, opposition parties played a very important role in maintaining democratic character of the system. Thus, this first phase of democratic politics in our country was quite unique. The inclusive character of the national movement, led by the Congress, enabled it to attract different sections, groups, and interests, making it a broad based social and ideological coalition. The key role of the Congress in the freedom struggle thus gave it a head start over others, as the ability of the Congress to accommodate all interests and all aspirants for political power steadily declined. Other political parties started gaining greater significance. Thus, Congress dominance constitutes only one phase in the politics of the country. We shall come to the other phases in the later parts of this textbook. And now, dear students, after listening to this audio, you are requested to study the entire chapter thoroughly before you start answering the questions. Thank you so much.